Yellow. We're talking sensation and perception today, which incidentally is one of the upper level courses that I teach at KPU. Here is the agenda for today. This is the list of topics that we'll be going through, starting with top down versus bottom up processing. Kind of lays the groundwork for the entire lecture. Then we will jump into object recognition, looking at essentially four different approaches. We'll look at unconscious inference, Gestalt principles, and environmental regularities. The fourth approach is not specific to perception, but it can be applied to perception. So we'll also look at Bayesian inference. And then at the very end of the lecture, we'll talk about perception and action, the dorsal and ventral pathways, which you might remember from intro. All right, so we're starting with top down versus bottom up processing. When it comes to our experience of the stimuli that make up our environment, it depends on two different processes, sensation and perception. Sensation is the ability to detect a stimulus, whereas perception is the act of giving meaning to those sensations. These two concepts of sensation and perception map onto two much larger themes in cognitive psychology. Bottom up processing, which starts with incoming sensory information. I literally think of it as the idea of like building up a representation from the foundations of the incoming information, compared to top down processing, which aligns itself more with perception. And that's the process that starts with knowledge, expectations, and experience. And it's sort of essentially what you bring to the equation. Now, I always thought of the concepts of top down versus bottom up processing as kind of abstract. And so I wanted to give you an actual experience of both of them. Probably the vast majority of you will not know what it is that you are looking at. And so the bottom up, you're having a bottom up experience. If you don't know what this is, your brain is engaged in bottom up analysis. So it might be noticing that it's like there's black, there's some white bits, there's two kind of large white blobs with sort of darker bits in the surrounding. Top down analysis of knowledge and expectations, you might not really have any at this point. But what if I gave you some expectations? What if I told you that this is C3PO and Princess Leia? That might have actually solved it for some of you. Some of you still might be living in that bottom up space, not being able to actually use the information I just gave you to organize this. However, if I show you explicitly that this is what the original scene looks like, if I go back to this fuzzy, blobby mess, it suddenly makes sense. You can't not be able to apply the organization of this scene based on the information that I just gave you, because top-down processing is actually an incredibly important component to sensation and perception. Interestingly, top-down processing comes into play more whenever your perceptual system is at a disadvantage. So if something is really far away, you're more likely to get the top-down fill-in. If it's dark, you're more likely to get that top-down fill-in. But also, if it's somehow compromised, this is an example of a painting. It's called American Gothic, and you can look up the original, but chances are you're familiar with the original already. Because you have that familiarity, this sort of Lego version that seems really pixelated can actually come into sharper focus if you give your brain a signal that suggests that your perceptual system is somehow compromised. In this case, what I'm going to suggest to you is squint. When you squint, you're telling your brain that you need help with your perception, and it basically says, oh, I got you, fills in some of those details. So this image actually looks more detailed if you squint. Show it to other people. This is kind of a universal experience, and it's pretty incredible. All right, so here is the story that we kind of started with. we started with these bottom up inputs, and we started to recognize fairly early with perception research that the primary visual cortex was involved with processing basic features, right? That's where the feature detectors live, and they are processing not even full shapes, they're processing parts of shapes, like a bar of light of a particular orientation, a bar of light of a particular orientation and moving in a particular direction, a bar of light that is of a particular length and moving in a particular direction. But these are, like I said, they're all just parts of shapes that then converge to make up full objects. So essentially, like, your retinas are detecting literally circles of light versus dark. At the level of the primary visual cortex, you get these basic features. As you move forward in the brain, representations get more complex. So now we're looking at the temporal lobe, where information is being combined for multiple shapes being processed together. We're looking at the output of a particular neuron, and you can see that this particular neuron's preference is for a complex shape, which is a circle with a line through it. Not particularly complex, but still obviously more complex than features or even basic shapes. We're now getting like a conjunction of shapes. But it's not until we get to the very front parts of the temporal cortex that we start to see neurons which are specialized for processing really complex objects like faces, or even scenes like places. And that is essentially what this little video was meant to represent. So when you're super zoomed in, that's essentially the information that's being processed in the primary visual cortex. As you move forward in the brain, the representations kind of zoom out, and clearly there's some sort of convergence happening, right? You have neurons that represent basic features that combine or converge on a neuron that represents a particular shape that combines with another neuron to represent a conjunction of shapes, till eventually you get to these really complex representations. But that's a presumption. I think it's a fairly safe assumption that we're making about what that process probably looks like in the brain, but we also haven't been able to observe that process directly. We can see neurons that prefer basic features in the primary visual cortex. We can find neurons that prefer these complex combinations of multiple objects together. And then we can even find those areas of specialization that process faces, places, and the body representations. But how we jump from, a circle with a line through it to a complex space like an office is probably actually, well, first of all, it's probably the domain of computational neuroscience rather than either sensation or perception or cognition. But this course is cognition, and we're going to come at it from a very cognitive perspective. So we're going to switch now to really kind of start talking about, instead of the bottom up, what are the top down factors that influence sensation and perception? That'll be the major theme today. So how are component shapes combined for complex representations? The answer is actually going to come from cognition rather than neuroscience. And like I said, we're going to start with object recognition, because when it comes to sensation and perception, like, this is the piece that cognition does really well, that cognition explains really well. And there's multiple approaches that researchers have taken from a cognitive perspective on object recognition. We're going to look at a few of them. If you are so inclined, this is the moment for you to pause and complete the H5P sensation and perception, bottom up versus top down processing. So feature detectors are bottom up ways of organizing object recognition, but it's naive to think that top-down knowledge isn't playing a role, and I've already let the cat out of the bag that that's going to be the major theme for this lecture, because when it comes to object recognition, experience is always playing a role. And We don't typically see objects in isolation. They're usually in a context of some variety. So if you look at this figure, I want you to take note of the object that's kind of on the left here. Tell me what you are, well, you're not going to be able to tell me. I want you to think about what it is that you think that object is. And what about the object that's sitting sort of closer to the viewpoint? What do you think that object is? Take a second. Interestingly, they're both blobs. They are literally, from a bottom up perspective, physically the exact same stimulus. They're a blob. That's a blob. That's exactly the same blob. And yet, you probably had two very different interpretations about what these objects actually were. Most of the time, what I hear is a car, and sometimes people are specific and say a cab. And then the other one, people say either a person standing on the side of the road or a fire hydrant. Those are the two major answers I usually get. This stimulus, though, I love it. It comes from a study that looks at the multiple personality of objects. And here's that original blob, and now the various examples of the blob in different low resolution scenes. So that low resolution was necessary in order to give some ambiguity to what it is the object might represent. And as I said, when our perception is diminished for whatever reason, we tend to see what we expect to see. Here, that what we expect to see is going to be based on orientation and context. And this is part of the idea that the brain is basically a statistical computer and prediction machine. It is constantly keeping track of probabilities, likelihoods, and it's using it to then interpret what we are seeing based on our previous experience. Because what we see is not the same as what we perceive. Interestingly, our heritage in cognitive science has been a bottom up approach to vision and perception of all varieties. So, when it came to vision, we really started with light coming in through the eyes and processing in the retina and processing in the thalamus before information makes it to the primary visual cortex, where it then goes off in two separate directions, parietal and temporal lobe, and then off to the frontal lobe, where there is action plans that get generated. But what's interesting, and that's literally the pathway that researchers have been following. We started with the primary visual cortex, and then we looked for these two pathways. But we now know what's become very apparent over the last, I want to say 20 years of research, is that for every bottom up input into the system, for every sensory based input, there are 10 or more connections coming from these complex processing areas like the frontal lobe and sending information back down to these sensory processing areas. It's as if the brain is taking in a little bit of information and then using what are called feedback signals, that top down signal from higher level areas into lower level areas. Those feedback signals are then essentially predicting what it is that we're likely experiencing. It's only when these processes break down that you notice how fast and efficient perception really is. 99.99% of the time, that guess, that little bit of information and the guess that your brain makes about what it is you're looking at are accurate. And so you don't even know that it's a guess. It's only when that guess is wrong that you're aware of the fact that your brain is making so many assumptions without telling you about them. All right, so let's talk about these different approaches to object perception. And we're going to start with the historical approach of unconscious inference. This approach was proposed by Helmholtz, Hermann Helmholtz, I think. Helmholtz had an idea of basically this concept of top-down processing through his theory of unconscious inference. So Helmholtz was actually a really important figure in the inception of psychophysics and the study of perception in the 19th century. And his approach or his theory was that some of our perceptions are the result of unconscious assumptions that we're making about the environment based on their likelihood. So imagine you have a situation where this is the image that makes it to your retina, this image on the far left. There are multiple interpretations. There's multiple stimuli that this image could actually represent. For example, you could imagine that this is two rectangles that are overlapping with the blue in front and the red behind. But also consistent with this retinal image is the idea of a blue rectangle and a red L-shaped shape that is literally like a puzzle piece just sort of wrapped around it. Now, which interpretation is probably correct? We go with the one that's the most likely, which is interpretation one. Interpretation two is probably, it's just very unlikely. It's just not consistent with our experiences of the world. Likelihoods help us solve ambiguities. But here's the thing. Literally every image on our retina is ambiguous. That is, it is literally open to more than one interpretation. But we resolve that ambiguity before we are even aware of it. So how many of you, well, I can't really ask how many of you. I want you to stop and ask yourself if you can make sense of what it is that you're looking at. I think probably a lot of people know what this image is. Even without the context, you're probably capable of understanding what this image is. But I think free of context is probably easier for you to stretch your imagination and imagine that this is a wall. That if you walked toward this object, you would smack it right in your face because it's actually a wall of boards that are arranged in such a way that they're kind of fatter on the bottom, and then as they move up they get skinnier, but that this is a wall that you will smack your face in if you walk towards. It's just not very likely. Even if I give you the context, it is still possible that this image, this object that you're looking at, which is in all likelihood a dock jutting out into the water, it's still possible that this is a series of boards that are nailed together in such a way that it's actually a wall, and if you walk towards it, you'd smack your face in it. It's just not very likely. And that's the whole point about this idea of ambiguity. Every image that makes it to our retina is open to more than one interpretation. We just tend to eliminate all of those unlikely possibilities before we even really consciously consider them. All right. Approach number two is unique among the approaches. We're going to look next at Gestalt principles of perceptual organization. So, Gestalt psychology, this is a German term that is used to refer to the entire pattern, form, or configuration. And Gestalt psychology has as its foundation this idea that the whole is different than the sum of its parts. Interestingly, I think Gestalt psychology is actually dealt with a bunch of different psychologically related concepts. So it was paramount in and really central to sensation and perception with the principles that we'll talk about. But you can also see Gestalt therapy. So the Gestalt psychologists kind of looked at psychology all over the place and really looked anywhere where they could find this pattern that the whole is different than the sum of its parts. And so when it came to sensation and perception, the idea is that it's possible for people to analyze specific elements of a scene in isolation. It's just like that's not what you tend to do. You tend to perceive a scene as a whole. And because of that, there are certain principles that get triggered and help us to organize information within a scene in very specific ways that force us to consider the entirety of the scene. So, Gestalt principles are these proposed rules to explain how small elements of a scene are grouped together to form larger units. And essentially, it's describing an organizing set of principles that guide the visual system in its interpretation of the raw retinal image. And mostly, it's about grouping. Most of these rules, by the way, also have this qualifier of like all else being equal, because sometimes more than one principle is at work and there's no rule to predict like which which principle is going to like win out in those situations. By the way, if you're not seeing it, this image does have an object embedded within it. It is not just an abstract pattern. Some of you might see the dog, some of you might not. Let me help you out if you can't see the dog. There we go. That's the outline. Now, I mentioned already that Gestalt psychology is unique in its approach among the three and arguably four approaches that we're going to be talking about around object perception, because it's not about recognizing what an object is. Like looking at this object here, fundamentally, you know, it's sort of an abstract piece of art. Like, what is it? Who knows? It's an abstract piece of art. But Gestalt psychology isn't exactly about recognizing that this is an abstract piece of art or recognizing like what it is as an object. It's actually more about recognizing that we are looking at an object which has a particular shape to it, and that there is a background to it, and that it's sitting on a surface and it has a base to it. The idea that we can sort of recognize which parts of the scene go together and which parts are separate or background, that is essentially what the Gestalt approach to sensation and perception is about. It's also about the idea that when we look at this abstract piece of art, it's entirely possible that behind the front arm there is a break in that second arm that we can't see. It's just not very likely, and so our brain makes the assumption that that back arm sort of is continuous in the same way that the front arm is continuous. So it's literally just about how we interpret the raw retinal image and parse it up essentially. So there's a variety of Gestalt principles that help to organize scenes perceptually. We're going to look at a subset of them, and you know, I actually really love the Gestalt principles because I think they're rather intuitive, but I'm going to go through them very quickly, and I'm going to set you up for an exercise that asks you to apply these principles. So the Gestalt principle of simplicity is essentially we tend to assume the least complicated organization or structure of an image. Here, for example, if you look at this, it looks like a cube that is sort of backgrounded by a series of dots that highlight the intersections. The reality is that what is actually making it to your retina is circles that have a series of breaks in those circles. You could even say that these are not complete circles. You could say that these are sort of like various iterations of semicircles that are arranged in a particular fashion to give the implication of a cube, but that's not what you describe. And in fact, when it comes to Gestalt principles, I think the easiest way to figure out how these apply to a particular situation is to describe what you're seeing. You don't describe these as a series of semicircles that are arranged in such a fashion. You would say it's a cube in front of a series of circles. The principle of good continuation is that lines that are continuous tend to stay continuous and move along in the same direction. It's possible that what we're looking at here are two kind of V-shaped objects that just happen to abut each other. It's just not very likely. And the way that you would describe this is you would probably say this is two lines crossing as opposed to two V-shaped objects that are abutting each other. Closure is our brain tends to close objects that have breaks in them. So instead of seeing this as four L-shaped objects, you actually would probably describe it as a square of some variety, maybe with breaks in it, but you'd start with the idea that it's a square. Parallelism is the idea that lines that are parallel tend to be grouped together, and they often tend to be thought of as the object as opposed to the background. Like, that is, these two diagonal lines that are parallel to each other, that kind of feels like maybe it's a pipe because it feels like an object rather than part of the background. And the way that you would see this, or you would recognize this, is that if you are asked to describe this, you might describe two diagonal lines and a vertical line. You're literally grouping them based on their parallelism. Similarity, if you described this image, you would probably say it is a square composed of circles surrounded by triangles in, enclosed in a square. Um, but here, what you're doing is organizing elements of the scene based on their similarity. You're grouping together the circles, you're grouping together the triangles, and you're also fundamentally grouping together all of these tiny shapes. Proximity, we tend to group things together based on spatial proximity, so things that are close together tend to be grouped together. If you were to describe this image, you would probably say two groups of dots, because you're literally grouping those dots immediately by proximity. And then finally, can I move myself? We've got familiarity here, which you can't see. I swore I checked through these, and then I threw this slide in at the last minute, and I forgot to check this one. Anyway, so this is familiarity. Behind that is a smiley face composed out of dots. And that's the whole point, is that you could talk about it as a box that has a series of dots that are organized into a semicircle with two other dots, but you wouldn't do that. You would describe it as the familiarity of a smiley face, like it's dots arranged into a smiley face. All right, so you now have an activity that you're prepared to do, which asks you to identify which particular Gestalt principle is at work in this particular image, or in each one of these images, actually. So each one of these is an example. Describe these to yourself and make note of how it is you're describing them. Now, most of these principles can be applied to multiple of these examples, but there is a way to do this exercise where you only use each principle once, and that's the point. But yeah, you would probably see, like the first one, there's probably like five, no, not five or six. There's probably at least three that apply there. But again, try to do it so that you're using each one only once. By the way, this one with the circles, the interpretation or the principle that you're trying to identify there is going to be the one that tells you why it is that you interpret this as a series of circles, as opposed to these 9 separate odd shapes that are just perfectly pieced together. So take note of that one. All right, we're moving things along. Approach number 3, environmental regularities. So perception takes advantage of regularities in the environment to help organize sensations. There are characteristics in the environment that occur frequently, including physical regularities, which refer to common physical properties in the environment, some of which can have pretty dramatic effects on our perception. One physical regularity that influences perception is related to orientation, and this is referred to as the oblique effect. So indoors and outdoors, there are more vertical and horizontal orientations than oblique orientations in the environment. And that's literally true of indoor man-made spaces. I want to say the only oblique oriented object that I can see in the indoor space is maybe the stairs, but they're actually composed of a series of horizontal and vertical lines. If you look outdoors, sure, we've got an oblique line that represents the slope of this hill, but like even all of the trees are oriented vertically. So literally in our indoor and outdoor environments, there are just more vertical and horizontal orientations. And that actually has an impact on the way that our vision develops. So we experience something called the oblique effect. Due to experience, perception is actually superior. Performance on visual tasks is superior when the stimuli are oriented vertically or horizontally compared to when they're oriented obliquely or diagonally. Here, what we're looking at is a series of stimuli that are called spatial gratings that vary in 2 dimensions, orientation and frequency. So at the top, you can see sort of a moderate level of frequency, but what's being varied there are the angle of orientation. At the bottom, you're actually seeing a difference in terms of the frequency, and researchers can use these spatial grading circles in order to test people's perceptual abilities. And what you do is you present stimuli that have a very high frequency and you ask people to make judgments about whether or not the frequency is the same or different on two patches, it turns out people do this task better if the lines are either vertically or horizontally oriented. If they are at an angle as they are here, people actually do worse. There's another effect that we see called the light from above heuristic. So, looking at this array of circles over here, are they popping out or are they sunken in? If you are having the typical perception, then probably what you're experiencing is that the circles along the outside are popping out and the circles on the inside are sunken in. And the reason that we have that interpretation is because of the light from above heuristic. Essentially, this is the idea that we assume light is coming from above. That's true outside, but that's also typically true indoors as well. And it means that shadow and light is going to work in a very particular way. So looking at these circles, if we assume light is coming from above, that light is going to strike that top shadow or that top edge for the circles that are popping out, and it's going to hit that bottom edge for the circles that are sunken in. But I can change our perception actually by just flipping this around. And again, because of light from above heuristic, suddenly our perception changes so that all of the circles on the outside look as if they're sunken in, and all of the circles on the inside now look as if they're popping out. Same assumptions. Now, another kind of regularity that we can see, another kind of environmental irregularity, is called semantic regularities. These are characteristics associated with functions carried out in different types of scenes, and they can actually have a very specific or a very strong impact on our perception and sensation. Semantic regularities is also, I think, an allusion to a broader concept that we call schemas, which is a person's knowledge about what's involved with a particular experience, or you could say it's an organized pattern of thought. But essentially, it's kind of like how categories work. It's how we figure out what happens at restaurants. It's how we know what goes in a kitchen. So a kitchen is a schema, and it's going to have semantic regularities as part of that. So kitchen should have a fridge, a stove, a sink. If you're lucky, a KitchenAid mixer. So, and this is essentially what is being hinted at with the multiple personality of objects. The blurred object is ambiguous in isolation, but when it has context, we are easily able to recognize recognize what the blob is supposed to be representing in the image, because context has such a big impact on how it is that we interpret a particular scene. Sun et al. Actually did an experiment to look at this explicitly. They wanted to see what the impact of contextual information was on people's ability to recognize and categorize two different categories of objects, which were animals and vehicles. So, in their experiment, they had participants fixate at center on each trial. Then they were presented with an image for 20 milliseconds, which is a ludicrously short period of time. It's going to feel like you didn't really see anything until you start to get used to it. And then a blank would be presented until participants made their response. And their job was just to indicate whether the central object in the scene was an animal or a vehicle. And they had three different conditions where they actually were manipulating the context. So they had the original context, so where either the animal or the vehicle was in its natural context. They had blank, where they literally kind of erased out all of the background information. And then they had a random noise condition where they wanted the same amount of visual stimulation. So what they did is they took the background that they had previously blanked out, and instead of blanking it out, they basically put it into a random noise generator that pixelated it and randomized all of that noise in order to produce this background. So essentially, you have the same amount of visual stimulation, but you're still eliminating that random background or that context through random background noise. Okay, so here we're looking at first the accuracy. So you can see accuracy goes from low up to high, and we're looking at the results for the original, blank, and random noise as a function of the animals versus the vehicles. first thing I noticed from this graph is people are much more accurate at categorizing animals compared to vehicles. That is an interesting finding that gets yeah, there's lots of repetition of that finding within the literature, that we are just better at recognizing or categorizing natural objects or scenes, compared to man-made objects or scenes. We have an advantage for nature. So immediately that jumps out at me, right? But then after that, I see the same pattern of accuracy for both animals and vehicles, which is essentially the idea that accuracy decreases as the amount of background information is decreased. So people score better when they have that full context information compared to when they have blank versus random noise in the background. That's interesting. That is compelling, because what it means is that when you see something for 20 milliseconds, you are better, you are more efficient at processing it if you have more stimulus compared to less. That is noteworthy. So Sun et al. Found that people were both faster and more accurate at object categorization when a coherent context was present. We're looking at the more accurate, but what I want you to do is draw out the graph for what you would expect for reaction time. This is something that you'll get to encounter in the module, but I want you to try to work it out now, and then you'll have a solid answer that you're gonna go with when you get to that activity. So just FYI, for this one, I'm actually saying just do slides 1 to 9, and then we're about to do Bayesian inference, which are going to be slides 10, 11, 12. But you could stop and do this now. Next up, we're talking about Bayesian inference. And I could have said that this is the fourth approach to sensation and perception from cognition, but I actually don't want you to think about it as exclusively applied to sensation and perception, because Bayesian inference is a much bigger concept that can explain so much more than just sensation and perception. But it can, in fact, explain sensation and perception, and to a certain extent, probably actually explains unconscious inference, the Gestalt principles of organization, and environmental regularities. So let's look at it. Bayes' theorem is used to calculate a probability of a hypothesis given prior evidence and updating it as more information becomes available. It's a formal mathematical model, and the probability of an outcome is determined by the prior probability, which is our initial belief about the probability of an outcome. Just how likely is this outcome to be in the world given our prior experience? And then there is the likelihood, which is the extent to which the currently available evidence is consistent with that outcome. So it's basically the current evidence. Over on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see an XKCD comic that is actually using Bayes' theorem to make a joke about the idea that if you hold a seashell up to your ear, you're probably like at the ocean. So of course you should be able to hear the ocean, which I think is really funny. Now, I think Bayes is actually easier to understand in the context of a medical example. So we're going to take this example of what's the probability that if you have a cough, you also have lung disease. We're starting with the priors. So this is our initial belief about the probability of an outcome. And my belief refers to my understanding of the probability that a person has any of these medical problems. Like, how likely are these in the world? Colds, pretty common. Heartburn, pretty common. Lung disease, fairly rare. So that is literally your prior experience and your prior belief about the likelihood of these as outcomes. The likelihood then is now actually basically the evidence. So it refers to the extent to which available evidence is consistent with an outcome. So here we can see that cough is the available evidence. And in terms of colds, That's actually fairly consistent. Lung disease is fairly consistent with a cough. Heartburn is not super consistent. If you have really bad heartburn, you might actually cough a little bit, but it's just a very low likelihood compared to colds or lung disease. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do some real, quick and dirty math. We're going to say that when two high numbers are multiplied together, you get a high number, but that when a high number and a low number are multiplied together, you're going to get a low number. So using that logic, we are going to come to this conclusion that what's the probability that if you have a cough, you also have lung disease? And the answer is it's low. It's very low. Interestingly, as I said, Bayes could probably be used to explain all three of the other approaches that we looked at to object recognition. Think about this deeply. How can Bayesian inference explain the likelihood principle? And not only the likelihood principle, but this example in particular. So literally, what is the probability that if you have this retinal image, that the blue rectangle and then the red object near it, what is, like, given that retinal image, what is the likelihood that you're actually seeing a blue rectangle with a red L-shaped object that is just closely sort of puzzle pieced close in together? Well, if you consider first of all, let's consider the likelihoods. Now, given the evidence that we have, given that retinal image, what is consistent with that outcome? Both interpretations that we initially considered are 100% consistent with with those outcomes. But now we need to consider the priors. In terms of what we experience day to day, what is it that is more likely? What outcome is more likely? Is it more likely that in the world we encounter two rectangles that are overlapping, or that we encounter these two relatively odd shapes that are just sort of puzzle pieced directly together? So that's a low prior probability. Then when we combine these, we come to the natural conclusion that we all reached fairly quickly, which is that we're looking at two rectangles, the blue overlapping the red. Now, here's the point at which you can complete object recognition. So go back in, do those last few slides 10 to 12, and then you'll be completed with the object recognition H5P. I always point in the wrong direction that way. All right, last but not least, we're going to be talking about perception and action, dorsal and ventral pathways. I'm going to ask you to actually pause here and complete the primer on double dissociations. This is something that I usually want to include it in the cognitive neuroscience module, but it's not relevant in the cognitive neuroscience module. It's relevant here in the perception module. And so I actually have decided to take this piece out and put it in right here because this is where it's relevant. So do that now so that you're prepared for what comes next. So we know that visual information is first sent to the primary visual cortex, but then where does it go from there? I mentioned earlier that it actually goes in two different directions simultaneously. Each direction is in charge of analyzing different aspects of the same stimulus. So we've got the what-where pathway distinction. The what pathway recognizes what an object is, whereas the where pathway helps to locate objects in space. Ungerleider and Mishkin were the first researchers to actually explore these two different pathways, to explore this distinction. And Ungerleider and Mishkin actually used ablation in monkeys to determine the distinct deficits that result from damage to the parietal cortex and the temporal cortex. So they created one group of monkeys that had parts of their parietal lobe removed and another group of monkeys that had parts of their temporal lobe removed. They also created tasks that aligned with the particular parts of the brain that they thought might be involved. So they created a landmark discrimination task where the monkey was being asked to locate where a cylinder is on the display, and the food reward would be underneath the food cover. It would be in the well that was closest to this landmark, this cylinder. So to be able to effectively do the landmark task, monkeys needed to be able to keep track of where objects were in space. In comparison, they also had a group of monkeys that had parts of their temporal lobe removed, and the aligned task was called the object discrimination task. So in the object discrimination task, the monkeys would be shown either this cube-like object, or they would be shown this sort of pyramidal triangular shaped object, and these objects would be then covering the food well. But they would start the trial by seeing one of the objects and then being presented with this display. Their job was to lift up the object they had just seen in order to uncover the food well with the treat in it. What Ungerleider and Mishkin found was that animals with the parietal lobe removed could not do the landmark discrimination task, but they could do the object discrimination task. However, monkeys with the temporal lobe damage had exactly the opposite deficit. They could do the landmark discrimination task, no problem, but they struggled with the object discrimination task when we're essentially guessing at which object they had just seen. This led to Ungerleider and Mishkin proposing these both functionally and anatomically distinct pathways, the what-where pathways. So the dorsal pathway is the where pathway. This is responsible for determining where objects are in space, whereas the ventral pathway is responsible for determining the identity of an object. This is the what pathway. And I wanted to point out that if you look back, you're going to see that my slides are congruently organized. I am continuously putting information related to the where pathway on top and the what pathway or the ventral pathway on the bottom, because literally that's where they spatially align in the brain. If I go back to this image here, you can see that I literally have the where on top and the what on the bottom, because the where how pathway and the what pathway are aligned there. If you want a really, I think, easy mnemonic to remember which one is the dorsal pathway and which one is the ventral pathway, I like to refer to the dorsal fin of a shark, right? If you imagine the brain as a little shark, and where would its little shark fin be pointing out of? That's the dorsal fin. And the dorsal fin is what actually pops out of the water when you see a shark. And so that is the dorsal pathway. And then the ventral pathway is the other one. It's the lower pathway. And it turns out there is a double dissociation for the what-where pathway in patients that suggested a new, slightly different interpretation of the data. So I wanted to just briefly review a double dissociation. The idea with a double dissociation is that you've got two patients with opposing deficits and two functions that, you know, the patients are going to be able to keep one but lose another. So we would have a patient group that would have normal functioning of the what pathway but maybe compromised functioning of the where pathway. And then a double dissociation would be another group of patients that would have compromised what pathway function, but still normal where pathway function. Let's look briefly at this, at an example of visual agnosia. Visual agnosia is a deficit in recognizing objects based on visual input in the absence of any major deficits in basic vision. It's not that people are actually have poor vision or low vision. It's just that they can't make sense of object recognition based on visual information that's coming in. Notice, however, how it is that this patient actually ultimately recognizes the object in this scene.
Let me give you a hint.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a choice, and you tell me what this is.
Okay, I can tell you then.
Okay. Is this a clock, a lock, or a telephone?
A lock.
Is it a lock?
A clock, a lock, or a telephone? Okay, let's rule out a telephone. What? A clock or a lock? Clock. Gotta be a lock. Must be a lock then.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not. But I don't recognize it as a telephone.
Mm-hmm. Do you recognize it as a lock?
No, honestly, I don't. But it's just, it really looks very indescript to me.
Uh-huh. But your hands know what they want to do
I know,
with
and
it.
they want to do something.
That's right.
I can see them.
Uh-huh.
I can just picture them, and I know that I have. It's like I'm undoing a combination lock.
Good. Okay, good. We had to work on that one, didn't we?
No shit.
That's okay.
So you probably pick up on the fact that this guy, this patient, actually ended up recognizing the object as a lock because he started to make motion with it. He started to like act out how you would use that object. That is interesting and relevant for where we go next. So, after Ungerleider in Michigan, we encounter another pair of researchers named Milner and Goodale who worked with a patient with visual agnosia, DF. DF suffered from accidental carbon monoxide poisoning when she was 34 years old. That was in 1988, and the result was bilateral lesions to her temporal lobe that left her with trouble recognizing objects. So DF was a very, is actually a very specific case from the case study literature, and she's very well known in this literature. So, working with DF, the researchers actually created two different tasks. Now, to understand the conclusions that they drew, something that you need to recognize is something about orientation. So if I ask this question, what are the kinds of properties that help to identify an object? Color is one, right? Size, shape, definitely. You know, if you're looking at a citrus fruit and you're trying to decide whether it is a lemon, lime, orange, or grapefruit, that is all going to be based on color, shape, size differences. But it turns out that there is another feature of object identity that is not relevant for citrus identification, but is relevant for identifying the difference between these two objects. So on the left, what we're looking at is a plus sign, and on the right, what we're looking at is an X. Most people would not refer to that as a rotated plus sign, right? Nor would you refer to the object on the left as a rotated X, because identity is tied to the orientation of the object here. And so that's a really key component of understanding these experiment results, that orientation is part of the identity of an object. And according to Ungerleider in Michigan, that information should only be processed in the what pathway, right? And remember, that's precisely the pathway that is compromised in people with visual agnosia. So Milner and Goodale created this task where they asked DF and control participants to take a card and match the orientation of that card to the orientation of a slot. They created they had like a contraption where they could rotate the orientation of the slot in all different directions. So on each trial, it was oriented differently. But where you could sort of bring consistency here is like, in order to plot all of the results on a single circular graph like this, that little notch on top, that little arrow point, is meant to represent the actual orientation on that particular trial. So they were different across trials, but they're aligning them there. And you can see that for the control participants, they're very good at being able to match that orientation like no problem. Easy peasy. DF, on the other hand, you can tell she is guessing. That lady got no idea what orientation that card slot at on every trial. You know, if it's here, she is literally in all of the possible directions, clearly guessing. But when they asked her to push it through the slot, when they asked her to mail the card, look at these results. Look at these graphs. Control participants nailed it. DF also nailed it. So, according to Milner and Goodale, their conclusion was that the dorsal stream isn't just about locating objects, it's actually about locating objects to take action on them. So their argument was that you only need to know where an object is if you intend to act on it, and that taking action would involve knowing the location of the object consistent with the where pathway or the dorsal pathway. So the idea here is that Miller and Goodale would make the argument that DF actually did know the orientation of the card slot, but only in the context of performing an action. So the dorsal pathway provides information about how to act on an object. And as if that information or if that action requires you to understand what the object is, you get access to that information. This is precisely why in that video we see of the patient as he's getting visual information, he's not being able to use that information to identify what the object is, but he is able to use it to identify how to interact with the object. And part of that is requiring knowing what the object is. So he got to object identification, but through the action pathway. So here's sort of the conclusion. DF's action pathway was preserved. And if her action pathway needed to know the orientation, it got access to that information, even though that should be in the what pathway. And even though her perceptual pathway was compromised, but she still gets access to that information because the action pathway needs it in order to act. So based on this, Milner and Goodale actually renamed these streams. They created one, the action pathway, that is a mechanism for judging orientation, and another for coordinating vision and action using orientation. So we've actually kind of got two double dissociations, although rightly, mostly double dissociations are referred to pairs of patients. However, you can really kind of think of the monkey research with Ungerleider and Mishkin as a double dissociation that was induced through lesions. So according to Ungerleider and Mishkin's organization, lesions in the parietal lobe allow you to maintain the what pathway but lose the where pathway. Temporal lobe lesions, you lose the what pathway but keep the where pathway. Now, Milner and Goodale, working with patient groups, we've now got people with visual agnosia who lose the perception pathway. They don't know orientation if it's just about object identification, but they maintain the action pathway, where they will get access to orientation if it's required for interacting with the object. But what we haven't seen is that other patient group with opposing deficits. So that would be a patient group that would be able to perceive or identify an object without being able to act on it appropriately. So do those patients exist? Yes, they do. This is referred to as optic ataxia. So this patient would be able to match the orientation of the object with her hand and even probably describe orientation verbally, but she can't take action on it. Let's have a look.
Now, I'm going to have you tell me whether my hand moves toward you or away from you. Can you see it? Which way?
It's coming forward.
Which way?
This way.
Look at the hand. Which way?
It's going further now. Now it's coming closer.
With no blinking threat. Now use her hand as the stimulus she does. Now, we're going to do the thing that gave you a little trouble earlier. We're going to have you reach and grab things from me, okay? Okay. Oh, before I do that, there's one other thing I want to do. What do you see here?
The comb.
Okay. And what do you see here?
The pen.
And what do you see now?
Both.
The comb and the pen, so there's no simultaneous agnosia. Now, which is closer to you, the pen or the comb?
The pen.
Are you having... Okay. Which is closer to you, the pen or the comb?
The comb.
Okay. I'm going to mix them up and try it again. Which is closer to you, the pen or the comb?
The comb is.
Okay. Which is closer to you, the pen or the comb?
The pen.
Very good.
Here's the real.
Now we're going to do some reaching. You weren't looking at it. Did you see it? You just did it. Okay. Just grab, okay, grab the hammer. Can you see it? Can you see it? No. Can you see it over here? Okay, try it down here now. Can you grab it?
That
That's good.
patient knows what that
Good, let
object
go.
is.
Now try with
She
this
would
hand.
have
Grab it
no
with that hand.
problem identifying that object.
Good. Put it down.
But
Now with this
she's
hand, grab
clearly
it.
struggling with visually guided action, which is exactly what
No, that hand's still giving you trouble.
Miller and Goodale
Right,
would
put it
predict
down. Let's
based
try this
on
hand
their
again. Grab it.
organization of the dorsal and ventral
Good.
pathways. So this is the point at which you can go and complete perception and action. All right, so at the end of this lecture, you should be able to recognize the distinction between bottom-up and top-down processing and how those concepts map onto sensation and perception, explain and recognize feature detectors, explain the effects of top-down processing on object recognition, describe feedback signals and explain their effects, explain Helmholtz's theory of unconscious inference, explain what it means that every image on your retina is ambiguous. Define Gestalt psychology for perception, define the laws of perceptual organization, and recognize novel examples. Explain how environmental regularities affect perception. Predict how the availability of context will influence accuracy and reaction time for object recognition tasks. Explain Bayesian inference and define the prior probability, the likelihood, and recognize novel examples of each. Identify the what-where pathway in the brain and recognize which pathway is recruited under different conditions. Explain why Milner and Goodale renamed the pathways, and identify agnosia and optic ataxia from novel descriptions, and explain how they are an example of a double dissociation. All right, see you guys next week.